So, in what I'm going to hit at a super high level, and my interest is in having this conversation at a really high level for certain reasons, is like we're going to talk about the concepts of what is service design, and what's design thinking. And that was really inspired by the theme, which I think we haven't really actually talked about today. We were invited to come here under this theme of the space between, and I think that's a provocative notion. And so I'm interested in looking at really big buckets because they have bigger spaces in them, and I think we can think more conceptually and broadly and theoretically when we're not focusing on really tiny things. And for me, one entry point into thinking about the different, sort of lenses of the stuff that most of us spend most of our time doing, and I just took a Industrial Revolution time point, late 1800s, and I think Jeffrey's going to invite us to think even further back than that when we had the Industrial Revolution, suddenly there were factories, and factory owners needed to hire people to make things, to design things to be manufactured. And at that point in time, that was really the sort of modern origin of a vocation of somebody who was working as a designer. And then a little time went on, and people started to organize and think more about professional practices and ethics and organizations and education and how did you learn for those vocations in a systematic way. And we started to think about professions. And then maybe in the middle of the 20th century, we started the beginnings of starting to really formally think about the disciplines underneath design. And I think this is relevant if I'm, going to try to help us think a little bit about service design and service design thinking. And so in the idea of that space is, bad pun, can you give me an and? And so the and is in, contrast to an or. A year ago with some colleagues, I helped found the Service Design Network Indianapolis chapter, and one of the first things that people wanted to do in that group was write an article about what's the difference between UX and CX, what's the difference between UX and service design. And so to me that represents or thinking, and I would rather invite more and thinking right now. Also earlier this week, as a part of this design week, there was on Thursday, Service Design Network hosted an event called WTF is Service Design. And my response to that kind of was WTF, like, why is that the conversation? Why is the conversation what the fuck is service design? It's, it shouldn't be that hard. And that's not coming from an expert view, that's coming from just a human view of, I think we all know what services are. And so I'll unpack some and point at some illustrations so that we can think at a more sort of basic lived life, everyday perspective, what is service. Did anyone, by the way, go to WTF is Service Design? Okay. During question and answer, we can talk about what the conversation was maybe. So services, what are they? I'm going to have to probably read these, and my intention was to go super fast. So there may be 10 or 20 like little everyday scenarios. So Mia checks in for her flight tomorrow using her phone. Amir orders a cappuccino at his neighborhood cafe. Olivia makes an appointment at the chiropractor's office. Miguel applies for a driver's license at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles office. I can't pronounce this name, but Amina purchases a song on her iTunes. Bendia registers for classes at the university. Lucia casts her ballot in municipal elections at the voting precinct. Liam navigates his way through airport security. Yi, or we, someone in here knows how to say this, takes her family to the amusement park. Jackson signs up for insurance on the healthcare exchange. Charlotte gets her nails done at the salon. Muhammad orders an Uber to go to the basketball game. Sophia mails a package at the post office. Yosef chooses a subscription plan for Blue Apron. Louise submits her expense report at work. Jack posts bail for his brother at the courthouse. Adia plans her wedding banquet at the hotel. Mateo joins LinkedIn to advance his career. Emily admits her father for surgery at the Veterans Hospital. Santiago files his tax returns. Aminthia returns a dress to the department store. I tried to be so politically correct and culturally aware that I picked the most popular names in the whole world, but I can't pronounce any of them. Felix participates in the employee orientation program in his new job. Alice takes the subway to get to her office. Ben applies for a tourist visa at the consulate. Adele performs jury duty at the county courthouse, and jury duty is not a song. It's a civic service. Hugo places his order on Instacart. Regina upgrades her mobile phone for a newer model. Hiroto opens a checking account at the bank. So, WTF, I mean, those things aren't that complicated, right? I mean, I think the question is do we think about all those everyday activities as services? And if they are services, what about them, where's the service in those activities? And so, just breaking it down at, the sort of most basic level is that my frame of thinking about services is that they're actions and transactions, and that actions are performances of tasks, and that involve the utilization of a resource. And a transaction is an exchange, and our mind automatically goes, I think, in terms of service to an exchange of money, but I'm going to invite you to really suspend that there is an exchange for a product or for some assistance or for some advice or maybe just for some goodwill. That exchanges can happen. When Poppy invited me to be on this panel, in a sense, there was a service exchange there. And services can work at multiple scales and complexities. And so a service can be a single instance of an action or transaction, or they can be a set or a series or a cluster. And I think the next slide, this is an article from 2008 in Interactions magazine by Hugh Dubberly and Shelley Evanson, and most of you probably can't see it, and even the ones who can view it don't know what's happening. But they are showing what they call the fractal nature of the experience cycle. And so there's this big model, and then you can zoom into every one of the nodes in the model, and the same model repeats itself. And then if you look at this article that shows how, and this is a case study for Apple, how there is a really large service system going on, and then you fly into it to the mid-level, and then you fly into one part of that, and there's this sort of micro level. And the case study is really great, and it takes you through a sort of the Apple consumer product experience and things that happen in the store and services within services. So, for me, if I were going to give a definition, I would say that service design is the intentional creation or improvement of processes that establish how these transactions and actions happen. That service design allows the needs of the operational system. In that operational system are people, places, information, and things required to deliver, in quotes, air quotes, deliver a service with the often latent needs of the person who's going to use or engage in the service, in that those needs are often, sometimes hidden, often hidden, sometimes they're practical, they're functional needs, in that there are also human factors, cognitive, physical, emotional, social, and cultural needs at play. And so meeting all those needs requires a certain kind of investigation and process, and I would say involvement, or maybe co-creation of the people that are in the service experience. How are we on time? Good? This isn't going off. Okay, we're right at halfway. Good. I'm going to reset the other half. My worst fear is going on for half an hour and y'all all being too polite to say anything about it. So the role, if we've talked about what service is, then service design and service designers are functions that align all these things. We have the needs of the creator of the service with the needs of the people who engage on the service. And I'm really going to try hard not to use words like use or consume, or but that participate in the service. And what's super interesting to me, and again, I want to make sure that I don't send the message that I don't think this is so hard, or that I say things like this ain't new because I'm an expert. It's not about expert knowledge. It's about basic knowledge. It's about knowledge that we all have as people who participate in these kinds of experiences every single day in our life from as long as we can remember. But to give you some frameworks for seeing like where these ideas have been engaged, a sort of early mid-century one, 1969, Herbert Simon, who was can Google him. He was a much lauded professor, scholar at Carnegie Mellon, and a father of computer science, wrote about design. He's not writing about service or service design, but about design. He's saying the intellectual activity that produces material artifacts, and so he's talking about designed things. So not abstractions, but things. He's talking about designing things. The intellectual activity to design things is no different fundamentally from the one that prescribes remedies for a sick patient, or the one that devises a new sales plan for a company, or that devises a social welfare policy for a state. So he's invoking, in a sense, the creation of things that are like services, and saying that people who design things are using activities that are that are no different than the same processes we use to make things like social welfare policies. Now, what I would say in hindsight is that probably what isn't designerly is the notion of thinking about social welfare policies top down. When we start to think about design and services, we want to engage people to think bottom up. So we're not imposing an outside order on a system, but organizing from within the system. We've already encountered Victor Papanak, our very first presentation. I wanted to give a big shout out to my colleague. So in a book, Design for the Real World, and the title itself, it evokes that kind of everydayness that I wanted us to focus on. Design as human ecology and social change. I'd invite everyone to, if they can, go to a library and find a copy of this book. It was well published. As an artifact, it has this giant fold-out with this kind of visual manifesto. At this level, you can't see the parts and pieces, but as a detail, one little part stemming off of this idea that Victor Papanak invites revolution. One of the first phrases in this book, one of the first sentences in the foreword was that he couldn't think of very many professions that are lower than design and lower in terms of value to society. And so at this point in time, he was really invoking, as a designer, a really strong argument against a kind of wasteful consumer capitalist a model of design that creates, all the shit that causes all the problems that we have. So at this point in time, 1971 is when this is published, and he's saying that the minimal design team is this model that has ecology, social behavioral sciences, anthropology, structural biology, psychology, architecture, engineers, media, and a representative of the real client group. And when he means the real client, he means not the person who's paying for the project to happen, but what we, language has its limitations, what we would probably all understand as the end user. And in a second, I'll critique why I don't like that term. And then looking in the book at some practical examples, I think Papanak was mostly using student work. Here is a detail of a design process where the design problem, this was a real project, design problem, to design a seating unit for secretaries. But what he's engaging is not a process of industrial design to create chairs, but he's invoking the design of a service system. And the book doesn't say that, but I know it's true because the things that are involved in the design solutioning are the designer's path if uninterrupted by other disciplines, a doctor's path, the treatment of work-induced diseases. So that's what? That's 1 minute, 2 minutes? 5 minutes, great, 5. So seeding for workers, and we're looking at how diseases are introduced and induced in the workplace. The secretary's path for doing their own work. Another path that's about the work habits and attitudes of the secretaries. And so, to me, this is really clear that this is about that notion of how do we facilitate in the best possible way the actions and transactions of a job role in a specific contextual environment. Here's another example from the book. And this is basically a service blueprint, long before I think that terminology existed. This is half of a flow chart for a study of using old railroad cars to bring healthcare services to poor rural areas. And it's work that's of a graduate student team at California Institute of the Arts. And that blew my mind because that's actually my alma mater, but when I was there, we weren't interested in anything like this. It was much more about the sort of designer as author in the 80s and 90s discourse of design. Another sort of key perspective for me in helping my own formation of thinking about what is design at what I call the disciplinary level, where Cross invokes the idea not of a discipline but as a culture. And so he says, one, coming from this study of children in the United Kingdom and how children learned, he talks about for the first time I've heard this notion of design with a capital D. So not little d design, which is doing stuff, but design with a big D, which gets baked into some definitions of design thinking. I won't read this whole thing to you, but it says, at its core, the culture of design, at its core is the, in quotes, language of, in quotes, modeling. And I thought what was really great in one of the presentations, Anna talked to us about synthesizing. And so this notion of the language of modeling, what models are doing are their tools for synthesizing. And so then I use the example of Hugh Dubberly, and there's an article in an AIGA journal from 2000 and the headline is Hugh Dubberly's Super Modeler. And so, baked into this culture of design are the way we make models, and that's how we actually design and represent the design of services. And then just real quick as a quick hit on how I relate to design thinking, and Jeffrey's going to dig deep into this, I think, and maybe even challenge me. But this notion that, design thinking to me isn't privileged because we understand that there's science thinking, we understand that there's humanities thinking. This is what Cross is calling cultures, and that these cultures are defined by a phenomenon of study, an appropriate method, and the values of the culture. And so just as an easy compare and contrast, phenomenon of study, in the sciences, it's the natural world. In the humanities, it's the human experience. In design, it's the artificial world. Those are things that are easy for us to understand. Thanks. So, design thinking presents a lot of challenges to people, but when we talk about scientific thinking, that's just accepted as a given. Nobody goes, well, how bizarre is that? You can't own that. Again, so I referenced Dubberly. This is almost 20 years ago, and he's framing this under brand, but he talks about the design and consumption of experience. And I would just challenge, here, I think probably for 2000, we talked about experience design, designing experiences. And I think, this, to me, also one of the notions of service is brought in. It's a reframing of designing experiences. So I accept that designers don't design experiences because people are subjective human beings, and they bring to every moment of their life all of their own background and knowledge. And instead, so I want to invoke from Elizabeth Sanders, 2006, the notion of that what designers actually do is create scaffolds. I'm going to wrap up really quick. In my easy way of thinking about designing a scaffold, it's like designing a jungle gym. nobody designed the experience of the children on this jungle gym. They designed the scaffold upon which children come and have experiences. They have their own experiences. Some are bad experiences. And then really quick hit, and I'll wrap it up really fast, this notion of why I said I didn't really ever want to use the word user when I'm talking about services or products or experiences. Sanders also gives us this evolutionary model of thinking about from customer to consumer to user to participant to adapter to co-creator. And I would add to that is like just the notion of a person being people. So, I know many of us might even have some of these words in our job titles, and so I don't want people to feel bad about them. But I think how we think and relate to these terms really shapes how we think about what we're doing. And so, when I hear the word consumer, I think of like a baby bird in a nest with their mouth open and their mother dropping the pre-digested worms. Like that's a consumer. That person, little baby bird has no other agency. They're just there to consume. And I don't think we think about people that way. So I think that's a wrap up. Again, pointing back to Papanak in 71, this notion that the client, the real client, has to be a part of the service design. And that sort of brings us back to that notion of the spaces in between. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Deborah Hayward. I find it very curious not wanting to use the word end user or user, but what word would you use?
Yeah, it's crazy. It causes problems.
Right.
I say people, and then you have to say which people, and then I can tell you which people, then I have to build more context for you to know, because saying people is not satisfactory. But maybe the extra added work of me having to explain which people is better than just saying user and then you assuming that you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's a problem, and it's hard actually to do it in a gracious way, because people don't like it when you don't use those terms. And you can't explain why you don't do it, because then you seem like a creep. Like, well, you're high and mighty on your horse, and you won't say user experience. You'll say people experience. And that's not what you want to do. But what you do want to do is you want to drive, the words we we influence how we think, and how we think influences what we do. So it's a problem. I mean, we could maybe meet the other ways. It's a great question. It causes problems. Yeah, I think so too. I like it even better than human. And I mean, I had a great philosophical question, like which was more real, saying people or humans? And it was interesting. I mean, it was somebody from another culture, and to them, human was more real, where for me, people was more real. And they related human to humanitarian, which was an idea that I didn't access at all.
All right, so service design, I think we all know what it is because we live in this world very quickly. When I tell my parents what I do, of course, they give me a very blank look. I also have the privilege of working in a very large organization where many of these services, in my case healthcare, exist. And in these organizations, I found that the process map is king. So when we have the concept of service design and the concept of the process map, how do we start to really bridge that gap in your perspective and change and shift their thinking?
Yeah, and just so that I don't assume, tell me what the limitation of the process map is.
So, at least in my experience, a process map really works along a single team's set of responsibilities, deliverables that exist within your specific job function. And I think that's fair. Most of us go into work and we don't necessarily think, how are we part of a larger service? We think about what we have to deliver in a day-to-day interaction.
Yeah, and so fundamentally, that's the first problem, actually, that that in of itself is pointing to the problem of not developing holistic solutions is because each of us in our silo are only owning one small part of the total system. And I mean, I'm my answer, which is, I have a leadership role in a consulting business. So my day job is to sell stuff. The best way to sell stuff is to be really reductive. So this is a challenge that I really understand. But that because of that, even though this doesn't make my job easier, I'm not willing to give up the fact that if I'm going to teach design thinking or service design thinking or even just really good solution thinking, coming up with the right solution thinking or the best possible solution for our people in this situation thinking, I mean, what I believe the real answer is that you first have to shape people's values, and that if you shape mindset before you teach tool set, and never get to teaching skill set. So that's my model, is that, in design thinking or whatever you want to call it, there's a mindset, there's a tool set, and there's a skill set. And the way that I help people think about tool set and skill set is, a carpenter has a bag of tools, one of which is a hammer. Don't forget that there is a skill with using the hammer. Just because anybody can pick up a hammer and hammer a nail, it doesn't mean they have the skill. Because the carpenter is going to swing the hammer differently based on the kind of nail that it is, based on the kind of wood species he's going to nail the nail in. He understands the skill of the tool. So when we go to one-day workshops or 3-hour workshops or even 4-week workshops to learn this stuff in a corporate environment because it's a change initiative, and all we do is teach the tools, and we don't teach the skills of how to use the tools, and we don't teach, most importantly, the mindset of why are you even here? Why do we even care about these tools? Then we're going to have that problem. And so I didn't solve the problem. I just pointed at we have a systems level problem, and so we have to use maybe some of those skills that Anna, talked to us about how to manage our colleagues and organizations. It isn't easy, which is why most stuff's bad.